Thank you very much for that incredible speech. Just a reminder before we move on, please can we keep points of information short and succinct and phrases of question, just not to derail the speakers. I will now call upon the second speaker of opposition, Professor Rebecca Probert. She is a professor of law at the University of Exeter. Her research focuses on the current law and history of marriage, bigamy, divorce, and cohabitation, and is the author of numerous articles and books. She was a specialist consultant to the Laws Commission's Weddings Project and a co-investigator on a research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation to examine non-legally binding marriage ceremonies. Rebecca, you have the ears of the house.
Thank you, Jess. So when Jess invited me to speak in tonight's debate, she gave me the choice of speaking on either side. And she may have assumed that, as a legal historian, I would be coming out and saying that, yes, marriage was inherently oppressive to women. And I have to acknowledge that in my research, I have come across some truly awful marriages. But my research has also shown that many of the claims that have been made about marriage in the past have been overstated. So I do want to try to bust some of the myths about marriage. And I should say that my focus is on England and Wales because that's where my research has been. I'm not going to be so presumptuous as to try to make claims about marriage globally. And I also think that to make the case that marriage is inherently oppressive, it has to be shown that such oppression is unique to and generated by the state of being married. And we've talked about singletons, but we haven't really talked much about cohabitation. And again, a lot of my research has shown that when we look at the history of cohabitation, we find women getting an equally raw deal, just with even less legal protection. And of course, we also need to take into account the broader social structures that underpin the way we organise our lives. If we got rid of marriage tomorrow, would the division of roles and responsibilities within relationships suddenly become equal? And as I also hope to show, I think marriage has changed so much over the centuries, and it continues to change and adapt. So for all of those reasons, I don't think it's tenable to argue that marriage is an inherently oppressive institution. So let's start with some of the myths. Now, we've talked about wives as property, but in England and Wales, certainly since the medieval period, I'm not going to stick my neck out any further, wives were not treated as the property of their husbands. Yes, we find Petruchio in Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew referring to his new wife Kate as his goods and chattels, but that is clearly meant metaphorically. He refers to her as his everything. And I think the myth that wives were property was perhaps generated by some of the language that was used by those justifiably protesting against women's legal disadvantages. And it was certainly also fostered by some 20th century judges. So if you want to find legal references to wives as property, you find them in 20th century cases, with judges very proudly saying, you know, wives used to be treated as property, but we don't do this anymore. Look how far we've come. And I think this is a really crucial point, that we don't mythologize the past, because it's very easy then to get complacent about how far we've come, to think that the only reason that things were so bad then is because we didn't have these particular laws in place. And that brings me on to domestic violence. So, second myth here is that it was legal for a man to beat his wife with a stick as long as that stick was no bigger than his thumb. Again, this is a complete myth. There was never any right for a man to beat his wife. She had the possibility of swearing the peace against him. He could be sent to prison for assault. And spent a lot of time reading Victorian newspapers and see just how seriously domestic violence was taken, even in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is not something that is tolerated. This is something that's seen as absolutely abhorrent.
What about rape and marriage?
Yeah, okay. So, it is a complete disgrace that in English law, it wasn't until 1991 that a man could be legally guilty of raping his wife. That is a complete blot on English law. Even then, you find in the 19th century, and even earlier, judges being critical of this. It's not something that is just accepted as this is the way it should be. And throughout the 20th century, you see judges chipping away at it, finding exceptions wherever they can. And again, it's important to bear in mind that women couldn't necessarily escape the presumption of consent by cohabiting. So although with marriage, it was a sort of irrebuttable presumption that she'd consented, still with cohabiting relationships, there was a presumption that she had consented to sex that she had to overcome. So yes, it's not it's a disgrace, but we also need to put it in context. And as I say, that went in 1991.
Can you name one society led by institutional marriage norms during which abuse towards women in the private sphere was mitigated in any way by the family courts or other such legal institutions generated by marriage as institution?
So I think my point is that violence is sadly not unique to marriage. You find it in cohabiting relationships as well. And you do find, as I say, judges trying to tackle it. So the point is not, we had this problem in the past because we didn't have the laws to fix it. And we've changed the laws and we don't have this problem now. This is what I meant about not being complacent. I think there's a clear problem with violence within relationships across the board, and it's not just heterosexual relationships, it's also same-sex relationships. But it's not just about one legal solution to it. There's a broader systemic issue there that needs to be addressed. So again, if we abolished marriage, we wouldn't get rid of violence within intimate relationships. And I think it's equally important not to romanticize cohabiting relationships. So you have some fantastic historic examples of wonderful cohabiting relationships, couples who live freely outside marriage. You also have some really, really toxic cohabiting relationships. And one particular example is Karl Marx's daughter, Eleanor. So she was living with the utterly dislikable Edward Aveling. And he was married to somebody else, which is why he couldn't marry Eleanor. But then his wife died. And he married somebody else rather than her without even telling her about this. And she committed suicide. So the history of cohabitation is not always a happy history either. And as I said, for couples who are cohabiting, there is the additional problem of the lack of legal protection. So we've talked about, different definitions of marriage, but at one level, you could just define it as this is a way of recognizing a particular unit as bringing with it certain rights and responsibilities. And you don't have that with cohabitation. You still don't have cohabitants having the same legal rights as married couples. I have 1 minute left. I do want to allude to the continuing unequal division of labour within marriage. Women's Budget Group has just published a really good report looking at women's poverty and children's poverty, and they identify the broader structural issues that have given rise to that. But these are broader structural problems that apply to married women, cohabiting women, and single women. And in my 9 seconds remaining, I do want to pay tribute to my amazing, kind, clever, handsome, he asked me to say that, and funny husband, who has been with me for 28 years, which has almost exactly overlapped with my professional career. He has put my career first all of that time. So I think marriage is always shaped by the society in which it operates, but it also shaped by the individuals involved. And we should never be oppressed by other people's expectations of what a marriage should look like.